Hello, I'm Richard with EV4U Custom Conversions. And in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the considerations when installing or adding a component to your conversion. And so we're going to talk about some of the generalities of this, the considerations in a general sense. And not by any means, all inclusive. You really need to consider the big picture before you do anything. And to get that big picture understanding, we highly recommend our online EV workshops, because that will give you the big picture understanding of the entire conversion, all of the components, how they're related to one another, how they're related to the vehicle, and your intended usage. But in this brief general sense, we're going to talk about some of the considerations. All right. When considering adding or installing a component to your conversion, one of the things you want to consider is the placement, the location, the proximity to other components, cooling requirements, any connections, electrical, mechanical. Does it have to be, in a location that is easily, accessible for inspection, so forth. If you've watched any of our video series on different vehicles, you'll see that we like to do everything in a very modular method that allows for easy inspection, easy testing, easy replacement, if any of that were required. Inspection is important though. You may never have to replace a component, but it's nice to be able to inspect. So, one of the things that then becomes important is the mounting. Not just the location, but the surface that you're mounting it to, the fasteners you're using, all of that type of thing will come into play. And then there's the mechanical, electrical connections. So some things will only have electrical connections, and some will have electrical and mechanical connections. For instance, power steering, power brakes, where you're going to have hydraulic connections or vacuum connections as well as electrical connections. The motor, you've got electrical connections as well as mechanical connections. And then of course, once we've got it installed and connected, we want to test it. So those are just the general things that we're going to consider when adding a component. Now, an example for this video is going to be a DC to DC converter. We're going to look at a DC to DC converter in particular and talk about all these things: location, mounting, and connections. Okay, so let's take a look at a just kind of a generic, common DC to DC converter. All right, here's an example of a DC to DC converter. You can see it's fenned, so it's air cooled, so it's going to need to be mounted. And one of the things under mounting is orientation. So you don't want to mount this like this ideally, although depending on the load and everything, you can, and we do on the buses. And that's because this is a 1,000-watt DC to DC converter, and it in a VW usage, most of the times you're not going to even scratch the surface. For years we put 400-watt ones in, and that was more than enough for a VW in most instances. So there's going to be the mounting orientation, preferably like this. You have 4 mounting locations. They're not very heavy. I'm not sure the exact weight of this. So there's times when, maybe only 2 are possible, and that would be sufficient for something like this. You can see it's got some electrical connections, and with a DC to DC converter, you're going to have typically, these connections. You're going to have your traction pack voltage in, which on this one is right here, and you're going to have your 12 volt out, and most of them are going to put out. You got to have enough potential difference to charge that 12 volt battery. And if you remember, a 12 volt battery is not 12 volts; they're 13.2 volts fully charged. So you have to have enough potential difference to charge that 13.2 volt battery. So most DC to DC converters will be at least 13.8, and some of them will regulate between 13.8 and 14.6 volts. This is basically replicating the alternator that you have in an internal combustion setup. It's going to keep your auxiliary battery charged and share that 12 volt load. So those are the connections. You've got a ground and the 12 volt positive, and this is the same way. You've got not a ground. Your traction pack is a floating system, but you've got traction pack positive and traction pack negative. And then this is for communications. And depending on your setup, you will use different connections. We're just going to use one wire, and it's a 12 volt enable. So whenever we turn on the ignition, it will turn on our DC to DC converter. Whenever the ignition's off, this is off. It's not drawing any current from our traction pack, and it's not running needlessly. And we have videos in the past where we talk about using these by themselves and in conjunction with the auxiliary battery. We always use them in conjunction with an auxiliary battery. So, with the DC-DC converter, as I mentioned, this is going to connect to your battery, and this is going to put out a certain amount of power, and you can figure the current by taking the power, dividing, the voltage, and we'll tell you the current. Well, so that's going to determine the size of wire. Well, if you're near the battery, which this is the charge, you may be able to get by with a smaller wire than if you're 40 feet away or 20 feet away. In a car, you'll typically be within 20 feet, depending on how you have to route things. So anyway, you want near the battery. On an air-cooled one like this, you want an area that's going to have enough space around it for some airflow, or at least an area that this can dissipate the heat and not be heat in itself. We also, because this is going to connect to the traction pack, we want to be near traction pack connections, so we don't have to run separate connections a great distance to this. And then we also want to be near a switched 12 volts, an ignition switched 12 volt source. So we're going to mount it in the vehicle, and I'm going to use the VWs that we have here on site. We've got a Volkswagen Thing and a Volkswagen Bug, and we're going to look at those. Actually, we could see the one on the transporter also. Anyway, let's take a look at the vehicles, and we'll come back to this. So here's that same model of DC to DC converter installed in the VW Thing. This green is from, and it's on there, it's stuck on there, it's from a padding that goes underneath the seat cushion. It makes a mess, and we vacuumed up the loose stuff, or most of it, but it's kind of unsightly. But when the seat's in place, you don't notice that. Anyway, here's that DC to DC converter mounted underneath the rear seat on the driver's side, opposite the battery. Now, on the VW Beetles and things, this is what we do. Check out some of our other videos, see where we put them in other vehicles. And anyway, proximity to the battery. This 12-volt battery had a pigtail on it right here off of the battery cable connection right there that came with that cable. It was on the vehicle when we received it. And so that was a good spot for us to connect to. And so that's exactly what we did. So we have the output from the DC to DC converter, goes through a fuse, and goes over to our positive on our 12-volt battery. The negative side comes over here and goes to ground. So short runs. That's a under 3-foot run. The input from the traction pack right here comes up and goes through to the engine bay or the motor compartment. And it connects to our main contactor, the battery side of the main contactor. We have an inline fuse and it goes forward to the DC to DC converter. The negative side connects here to our shunt. This is the battery side of the shunt. None of our loads are connected on this side. They're connected on this side, opposite the battery, so that we're measuring all that current in and out. This is the charger coming in right here, or going to the charger, and this is the DC to DC converter. The other connection is a 12-volt switched in one of these, and I don't remember which one it is just off the top of my head, but we have a Legend. But one of these is the switched 12 volts, and when the ignition's turned on, we have 12 volts there, and it turns on the DC to DC converter. So just as I had on my list here, we have the thing mounted in the vehicle. The traction pack is wired. The positive is fused, and the negative goes to the DC to DC in. The output connects to the 12-volt battery terminal there, and of course it's fused, and then it goes to ground, and we have a switched 12 volts going to the enable, so that when we turn on the ignition, the DC to DC converter comes on. And so we're going to test the operation. And so I've got the traction pack turned off at the main disconnect. So when I turn on the ignition, the gauge will come on, and we're going to measure our 12-volt battery voltage, and then we're going to turn on the traction pack so that the DC-DC converter come on, and we'll see, the difference here. So this is just the 12-volt battery by itself. Turn on the key, let it come up, and it looks like it's reading just under 13 volts. I'm at an angle with the camera, but I'm looking at myself, it's close to 13 volts. Okay, so now we'll take a look at it after I turn on the traction pack. So now we have the traction pack turned on, and so here's our gauge, and I'm going to turn the ignition on, and so now when I turn on the ignition, the DC-DC converter should come on. Try to get the least amount of glare here. See, the gauge goes up, and it's going up, and it's right at 14 volts. So guess what? That tells me that the DC to DC converter is on and charging my 12-volt battery. And that's exactly why we put the 12-volt gauge in all of our conversions, is that at a moment's glance we can see that the DC to DC converter is working. And we could check the 12-volt status, without it charging very easily also. So that's the system installed and tested. This is the 61 Beetle that we're working on. Kind of bad lighting here because everything's black. Right now there's just some junk underneath the back seat on the driver's side. They get a fire extinguisher there. But anyway, that's where the DC to DC converter is going to go. And then, of course, connects to the auxiliary battery right here. And then there will be the 3 wires, 2 for the traction pack connections and 1 for the enable that will go through here. Of course, it'll be mounted to the floor. And in this case, we only mount it with 2 bolts. It's not going anywhere, and that's more than enough. In the engine bay, which is, just like the thing, still being worked on. They're not completed yet, but we'll run and connect right here for the, positive on the traction pack, and the negative on the traction pack will be up here. And the 12-volt enable will be one of these. Again, not sure without looking at, I know which ones it's not, but I'm not sure which one it is. I think it might be this one, switch 12 volts. But anyway, that's all there is to it in this particular case. But you can see, short runs, easy thing to install. This is our 1991 Volkswagen Transporter Doka. I slid the seat forward, so this is the cavity underneath the front seat. This is the location, stock location of the 12-volt battery, right there. Right in front of it is our DC to DC converter. And it is, fused. This style, we have diode protection on it. Anderson connector so we can easily remove things. So that's the 12-volt stuff is all right here. This is the 12 volts out. The traction pack stuff in actually is just in the front of the vehicle, and so it's only about 3.5 feet, because in the front of this we have connection that goes to the heater, and so this has a heater reservoir. We have liquid heat that just ties into the existing heater core on this, and so there's a pump and an element, actually 2 elements in this reservoir, heats the water. Actually, the heater works really well on this thing. Anyway, so we had traction pack voltage up front here for that already, for the heater, and so it was a relatively short run to run it to our DC to DC converter. This one, it doesn't have an enable circuit. It's turned on and off by a relay, which is right down here. So whenever the ignition comes on, it provides that power to the DC to DC converter. And it works. And it just sits underneath the front seat and has been there since 2013. All right, so that concludes this video presentation. I hope you gleaned a little something out of it. Like I said, just a general overview. You're going to want to consider, put some thought into where you're going to locate the component. What does it need to be close to? What's it connect to? What are all the considerations? Mechanical, electrical, cooling, all these considerations, orientation. Where do you have room for it? Can it be easily inspected? Under the seat on the VW is real easy to inspect it or replace it. And most vehicles you put in, it's in a location that's easy to get to. As 99.9% of the stuff that we do is that way. We consider the what if. What if it were to fail and you have to replace it? Is it going to be a nightmare to do? Well, being a shade tree mechanic all my life, I can tell you I've suffered a lot of bloodshed and had to say a lot of magic words to replace items that in the automotive world or otherwise, that those that did the design didn't really care what I thought. I care, and so when we design things, we have that, in mind. So, placement, your mounting, your connections, and then testing. And when you're doing a conversion, as much as it is possible, I recommend testing things as you go along. Don't do the whole thing and then go to, test it at the end and find out this doesn't work, that doesn't work. Some things will be interrelated. But if you test as you go, it'll be a much more streamlined, simplistic, and fewer headaches if you do it in a methodical, sequential manner. So, appreciate you watching. Most of the people that watch our videos are not subscribers. And if you're watching and you're not a subscriber, why don't you think about becoming a subscriber? We're hoping to bring, we've got a few projects that we've been featuring here that we're getting close to wrapping up. We have another series that we'll be presenting later on. But beyond that, we're going to pretty much gear future videos to nothing but the educational aspect. So kind of go back to our roots. We've featured different conversions just to give you an idea. I think we've pretty much established all that we can as far as to give you the basic overview of a conversion to where you might be excited in doing it. And so we're going to kind of touch a little more on specific educational topics going forward. So might be to your advantage to subscribe and to click the notification bell. And personally don't like standing in front of a camera, and I have lots of other things to do, and so we appreciate the feedback through positive comments and likes to say, hey, taking the time. I mean, I got the cooler off right now because it makes too much noise, and there's enough background noise as it is, but with the cooler running, you would hear. So I'm sitting here, getting uncomfortable, and so, give me some incentive that, hey, my being uncomfortable, trying to share information with you is worth the bother. And I hope it is. If it's not, well, we'll take the hint and we won't see you again. But if this is something that you do enjoy or get some value out of, I don't know how much enjoyment you're going to get from me, but if you get some value out of it, then let us know. And in that case, we'll see you again.